So what era are we in now in the tech job cycle? Well, we're actually in a new era, one that really arguably hasn't been experienced before, and that is the Gen AI supply explosion. And that started in 2023. We all, remember ChatGPT coming out, and that really opened the world's eyes to what was possible. Now, many of the tools had entered the market, really in as early as like late 2021 and 2022, but they really were popularized with the emergence of ChatGPT. What does this mean for technology specifically, though? Well, this Gen AI supply explosion can be, you can best kind of put a finger on it by looking at the usage of Copilot, GitHub Copilot specifically, but there's lots of other tools, that have come along. Cursor is an IDE that has come along, which is really quite strong, and then there's tons of others, and every major player has a version, so you've got Gemini's, you've got Amazon Code Whisperer. Again, in fact, actually, Claude is one of the best at writing code. So there's so many options. Apparently I picked the 3 C's, but apparently there's so many different options as far as code generation. What's the net impact, though? So I should start by saying that what we're talking about here is productivity or supply growth. So what does that mean? Productivity growth in the economy means how much output per human hour worked is possible. And productivity growth is basically responsible for all economic growth we've had over the last several centuries. And it typically rises at a couple percent a year. That's actually decent productivity growth. There are certain cycles, certain eras in which it explodes upward. So when the car was invented, all of a sudden you could travel much faster, and so productivity growth exploded. Telephone. Think about those big, turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And then when the internet came along for the first time, you did have some rise in productivity in the late 90s as all of these technologies got adopted. Arguably smartphones and some of these other technologies that have come along. But specific to tech and to software development, what's new here is that Copilot, according to Microsoft studies, leads to something like a 53% productivity jump for developers in the studies that they've released. Now, of course, those are meant to be flattering, but I would say, if anything, these could be a bit conservative. In my own experience, I think, and so this is Microsoft, so reputable but biased, let's say. All right, I'm going to throw my number at you. This is from my own personal experience. I have seen a 100% productivity jump measured in terms of, number of dev tasks, really story points, complete per week, using a cycle like that. And so we'll just call this the fraction number. So we're seeing a substantial jump in productivity. And we've seen this, and that's my own estimate, but I've also heard this from others, and we encourage all of our engineers, all the fractional talent that we work with, to use these tools. And in fact, it's part of our interview process is to select for those folks who do use these tools. So we're seeing a huge productivity jump as a result of that. So what happens when you go from a couple percent a year productivity jump to all of a sudden folks being able to shift their productivity upward and jump by 50% or 100%, so as much as doubling their productivity? What does that end up looking like? Well, let's see what that looks like. What does that do to supply and demand, right? So let's say we have a chart here, and what we're looking at is a typical supply and demand chart. So typically speaking, if you remember your Econ 101, that's going to be your supply. And then this is going to be your demand. And if I can write it here, this is going to be demand. And this is going to be price, which in this case means salary, because we're talking about a supply and demand chart for labor, for work. So salary. And then this is going to be quantity, but we're actually not going to talk about quantity of jobs. We're going to talk about code quantity. So if we talk about it from the standpoint of code written, right? Production quality code written is actually the thing that companies are buying. They're not really anyway, buying just developer hours. What they really want at the end of the day is production quality code. So typical supply and demand, matches at whatever the typical market salary has been in the United States or even globally for this market. But here's what's happening. When you shift, because of these new tools, you shift this supply curve out. Notice what I'm talking about here is I am not talking about developers being replaced wholesale by these tools. That's a silly concept. That's not possible yet, despite all of the hype from whatever it was, Dev.AI or a lot of these other players. What is possible, though, is these 50 to 100% jumps in productivity from senior engineers. So a senior engineer who chooses to wield state-of-the-art tools versus a senior engineer who chooses not to. That's where you're seeing the jump in productivity. What does that do? Well, again, Econ 101 tells us that the supply, the ability of a given developer in a given number of hours to produce code that is production quality has increased. And even if it's more conservative than the big numbers I'm using, even if it's a 30% shock, that's a very substantial supply increase. So that supply increase, well, what does that do? That increases the amount of code that goes out into the world, right? Because it goes from here to here. So the amount of quality software being written is actually rising as a result of this. And by the way, I'm talking about these tools. There's another force impacting the market here that we haven't talked about yet, and that is low code. Low code and no code solutions have really come along. They are light years ahead of where they were. And they've existed since the 90s, right? Various forms of sort of code generation and app builders have existed for decades. They really weren't very good. All of a sudden, through a confluence of, just overall technological capabilities and maturation of the cloud and other forces, all of a sudden low code is surprisingly good. You can build a lot of real applications using low code. So that's another supply shock. That's another way that the supply curve is increasing. Can you build massive scale enterprise systems or even, build really, advanced technology on low code? Generally speaking, no. But a lot of basic use cases can get solved there. So that's an outward supply shift. So you've got this outward supply shock. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see if demand doesn't also rise, then what happens is, overall more software gets produced out here versus here. So more software is being produced. But salaries, the price of software drops, right? Simple Econ 101. So that's one of the effects that we're seeing in the current job cycle is that if I can produce, let's take the extreme case. Let's say productivity really doubled. If my demand curve didn't shift at all, then I might expect that the needed supply of developers could fall, not by 50%, because I've doubled supply. If you had a vertical demand curve, then that would have the number of developers needed because you've doubled the amount of code that can be produced and half the developers you get back to the same place. But in fact, more software will get produced because the demand curve is quite likely not vertical. And so more code will get produced, but it could lead to a shock where over time, the number of developers that need to be working, it might drop by 20, 25, 30%. And so that's part of what we're seeing. Now, in reality, like I said, more software is going to get produced. How much more software the world needs is an interesting question. If the demand actually rises as a result, so not just based on sliding along this demand curve, but if the demand curve actually rises as a result of the ease with which you can produce quality software, then that might offset, and you might have less kind of drop in overall kind of demand for developers. But the base case here is that you have to expect that when these tools come out, if you as a developer have found yourself more productive using these tools, or if anybody you know is talking about that, then you are going to see, on net, some drop in the demand for developer hours because productivity has gone up so sharply.